Cool. We're live. Now I feel important. All right. So it's globalization, anti-Semitism, race, and Israel bashing. And as I was saying, I mentioned yesterday, I think an important part of the work that we're doing at ISGAP is trying to create a conceptual framework to understand contemporary anti-Semitism and to kind of create critical anti-Semitism studies. And in a sense, despite the fact that anti-Semitism, as Robert Wistrich, a famous professor of anti-Semitism, argued, and I believe correctly, you can make the case that anti-Semitism or Jew hatred is the oldest form or the longest form of hatred. And despite that, in a sense, those of us studying and concerned about anti-Semitism are, I'd say, a generation or two behind scholars that have engaged the study of race and racism and gender inequality and sexism. That we know if you study issues of race in Western universities, we have a deep understanding or an understanding of the history of racism, the construction of identities, how even in our language, concepts are used in everyday language that connote the ideology and the power structures of society, that words are loaded with notions of racism and sexism. We know in American and Canadian and European cities how where people live, the demographic patterns of where people live in certain spaces and cities. You're nodding, I'm thinking of South Africa, American cities. We know that issues of racism affects where people live, where they work, levels of education, access to basic services and the like. So when you have a liberal education, and if you're not really a bigot and your mind is open, you can learn about the power structures in your midst to some extent. And there's progress, obviously, and tragically there's a lot more progress to be made, but there's been some progress. Even it was in the late 1950s, as crazy it is, there was a group of historians at Yale University who were the first white scholars, or mainstream scholars, if you want to say it, that started to understand and study the legacy of slavery and racism in the 1950s. It was the first time, right? So we've come a bit, we've made some steps forward, many steps to go. But when it comes to the study of anti-Semitism, we are kind of in a quagmire. We're kind of stuck. What is anti-Semitism? When is attacking Jewish people in university spaces as being racist for having an affiliation or a connection to the state of Israel? For example, one example, my father could not go to university growing up in Montreal because of Jewish quotas at universities in Montreal, Anglo-Saxon Protestant universities. Those are the only ones that English people were able to go to. So he couldn't go to university. My generation, universities were open to us. I went to McGill. And my generation of, North American Jewish people, education was open to us and the professions were open to us. A couple of years ago at McGill University, I have two nephews who stayed home from school because the student union passed a resolution that it was Punch a Zionist Day. So they stayed home. They're big guys, they go to the gym. But the Jewish kids stayed home that day because the student union passed a resolution that it was Punch a Zionist Day. The principal of the university, the community, the students, the community were outraged. The principal, after months of investigating the situation, came to the conclusion that this was not an anti-Semitic incident, but it was more a reflection of political differences among the students at McGill University. So we can see Jews being excluded to the inability to identify what a gross and sort of flagrant act of Jew hatred is, that we're kind of lost. And I would argue, to a large extent, the fact that we cannot really define anti-Semitism in our society, and it's very controversial, and there's different definitions, and there's competing definitions, and certain definitions are labeled as good and certain definitions are labeled as Zionist propaganda, is that in the academy, in universities, it's been a form of hatred, what Norman Potteridge called the hate that we dare not speak its name. The hate that we dare not speak its name. And universities, scholars, intellectuals, the literature is way behind people who've been dealing with issues of race and racism and gender and sexual inequalities or gendered identities. And Ben is sitting next to me, and I think taking the experience of the gay pride movement and trying to infuse some sort of energy into the discourse and grappling with the rising forms of Jew hatred in the world is very important. So what we're doing at ISGAP, and the situation becomes more and more urgent with, I think, each passing academic year, is that we really need scholars to engage these issues from different perspectives and different disciplines, different political perspectives, ideological, philosophical perspective, different disciplines, and to really create a network, an international network of intellectuals who are working at the highest level of scholarship to engage this rapidly changing global situation. That now we've entered into a space, and you'll see it at the CST when we go to London on Monday, next Monday, that in the West, in European countries in particular, and in North America and the Americas, in South America and Chile, in Mexico, really Argentina, there's a lot of issues internationally where the demonization of Jews is accelerating to the point where when we go to the Community Security Trust, this is a security organization that defends the Jewish community, you will see a situation room, I hope they'll bring us to the situation room, where the Jewish community monitors the entire Jewish community of the United Kingdom from a situation room in London in real time, where they deal with threats in the United Kingdom, in the UK, from the radical right, from the radical left, and also from political radical Islamists in the UK. That it's not just the demonization in these sort of liberal postmodern spaces like the university and the media of record, there's an onslaught where it's not only okay, but I would argue, and I'll argue in my lecture, that it's encouraged to demonize and to attack Jewish people in the intellectual circles. And this has been going on for decades. I guess there was a quiet period or a honeymoon period. It's strange to see. There was sort of, I think, after the Holocaust in the West, there was a moment where, hating Jews was a bit much. But I think after 1967, one can make the argument, after sort of 20 years of a reprieve in the West, that it began open season on Jews once again. And, even I get surprised at times. But when we examine issues of racism and gendered inequality in societies, and we look at the history of slavery, we look at the history of Jim Crow, we look at the history of language, of housing patterns, of employment patterns, we know how deep, even last night that I had to discuss a gendered issue that happened in our midst here at ISGAP, these behaviors are deeply entrenched in the ideologies and the values and the culture and the symbols of our culture. And there is not this deep analysis that goes on in the study of anti-Semitism, and I think it should not be. If we put anti-Semitism or Jew hatred in context, it should not surprise us that these old hatreds are reemerging. It should not surprise us. And yet, I think many of us are outraged and surprised and shocked when instances happen. So it's interesting. So I think we need a deep, I dare say, structural analysis, an interdisciplinary sort of structural analysis of the roots of anti-Semitism in Western civilization, the deep, fundamental, foundational roots of Jew hatred in our religion, in our education, in our social sciences, in our science, in eugenics, in theology, how it is pervasive, how the Jew has been portrayed for centuries. That if the Jew is portrayed as the quintessential other for all sorts of reasons that I'll get into, for centuries, is it any wonder that the Holocaust happened? And if the Holocaust happened, why are we shocked in this civilization, in these societies, that there's anti-Semitism? And that is, I would say, the weakness of scholarship on the subject matter, and because of the lack of in-depth interdisciplinary scholarship that deals with history, that deals with religion, that deals with social science, that deals with ideology, that deals with economics and politics. Because of that lack of deep understanding, we end up sort of being the surprised when this crap happens. And and I'll get into this, but Emmanuel Castells, who was I think a very important scholar on urbanism and issues of globalization, he said that the last space, sort of in a reactionary moment in society in terms of socioeconomic processes, he was kind of a structural Gramscian Marxist, that when you cannot struggle at the political, economic, and social levels, and we start dealing with issues of identity, that's an indication of kind of the emergence of reactionary societies. And that when groups of people are defined by the other, and this is so important, and this touches on the rabbi's very important presentation last night, when a group is defined by the other, particularly when the majority defines a minority group, when the minority group cannot define themselves in society, that's the expression of a profound weakness. And it's amazing in the sort of racist, deeply racist, colonial, arrogant, I have to say, legacy of Western civilization, that the Jew could be defined in racial categories, 150 years ago as not white and worthy of exclusion, worthy of removal from society at all levels, and worthy of the final solution, of extermination, because of their racial and religious and cultural baggage. And just a generation or two later, you have clowns who pass themselves on it, they're clowns, who pass themselves off as intellectual leaders and are consumed as intellectual leaders, who then, in a generation or two, define the Jew not as non-white, but as white, and not as sorry for what happened to you all these centuries, sorry for the Holocaust, sorry for the pogroms, sorry for the exclusion, welcome to the club, right? Now, these clowns define us as white and the quintessential embodiment of racism, of the colonial legacy, and of apartheid. And these are not, characters at Hyde Park and who are standing protesting, on medication in the town square. These are people who occupy some of the most important chairs of philosophy, of literary criticism, who are at the Ivy Leagues and at the Oxbridges of the world. And and I'm choosing my words deliberately, just like the universities leading up to the Holocaust were the intellectual foundation of excluding Jews from society, of justifying the Holocaust, the theologians who taught at the best universities in Europe and in Germany, the scientists who created racial notions of supremacy and inferiority and shapes of phenotypical, it's insanity, but this was the science. And all of this knowledge and education literally was the foundation for the Holocaust. And the universities in Germany were the only institution in society. It wasn't the army or the union, you know. It was the universities that voluntarily gave up its Jewish faculty and students. So there's a legacy of universities playing a crucial role in justifying gendered inequality, sexism, racism, and anti-Semitism. And now, once again, we have, and I'll get into it in my lecture, intellectuals defining the Jew. And this is the context, the intellectual context in which we are trying to, I guess, unpack and understand anti-Semitism. And it's not an easy task. This is a hatred that's gone on for thousands of years. And I would say this is a hatred that is fundamental to Western society. And if you think about it, Elie Wiesel, I was thinking about this last night, Elie Wiesel always taught us that anti-Semitism is not a parochial Jewish problem, but it's a problem of humanity. And anti-Semitism begins with the Jews, but it never ends with the Jews. And I was thinking last night, I'm going to speak about colonialism, and I was thinking about, the history of anti-Semitism. But he was, think about it. Before the Europeans went out to colonize the world, before they went to capture 80% of the landmass of the earth, before they engaged in notions of inferiority and superiority, and deep in our philosophy, Hegel with his ladder of consciousness, where the white man's on top and the dark African man's on the bottom, and everybody's sort of in the middle, right? When they go out to impose this on the world, when they go out to forcibly convert people, if they were worthy, because there were some races that were not even worthy of conversion, they had to be eliminated. So you have forced conversion, you have history of genocides in Africa, in the Americas, right? But it started with the Jews. When these guys set off on their ships, who did they deal with before they went sailing? They were dealing with the Jews. So it's interesting. And I think to reiterate, in this sort of interdisciplinary framework which we're trying to create at ISGAP, and everybody here is very welcome to contribute and participate, and what Emmanuel Castel said, that the group, we have to define ourselves. Jews have to understand who we are, who they are as well. And to draw on Jewish wisdom, which, the Jewish people are blessed because the European colonialists and waves of empires, from the Egyptians to the Babylonians to the Greeks to the Romans to the Europeans, right? All these empires that have risen and fallen, we're still here, and the Jewish people still have intact a profound body of wisdom and knowledge. And in a way, we're very fortunate to have that, because how many colonized people have been, forcibly removed physically from the earth and culturally assimilated? I mean, the Pope just went to apologize to some of the indigenous people in what is now Canada for making it, illegal for them to practice their culture, their wisdom, their religion. So the Jewish people, in a way, and I think those of us dealing with anti-Semitism needs to draw on definitions and understandings who Jewish people are, who we are as a people, not a Semitic race, not a non-white race, and not a white race, and all these identities that are being, shoved down our throats, but to come up and to have informed conversations and discussions about notions of Jewish identity that is deep within our culture. And this draws upon, I mentioned, black consciousness in South Africa. Those who struggle to be free need to be deeply in touch with who they are as a people, what their concepts are of who they are, of what is the other, notions of justice, right? There's all sorts of ideas that are profoundly important that we need to understand. And one concept that comes to mind, I spent a few months in northern Labrador with the Innu people. A good friend of mine is a chief of the Innu, Innu. His name is Peter. And Peter, it's a long story, but he's a very powerful chief in the history of the Innu people for cultural reasons, which I won't go into. But I went to his house, and they're still hunting and gathering in northern Labrador, and they have this small village where when they're not hunting, when they're not in the country, they come for like a month or two, occasionally, and then they go out into the country. So it's a small house by, I don't know, our standards, I guess. It had 2 small bedrooms, one for Peter and his wife, and one for the kids. And I came, and they wanted to give me the children's bedroom. And I said, no, I'll sleep on the sofa, it's no problem. Anyways, they insisted. So I slept in the kids' room, and the kids were on the sofa on the floor. It was embarrassing. And I said, thank you. Nobody responded. They cooked meals. I was there for a few weeks. Every meal that they cooked, they would say, I'd say thank you. No response. Right? So after a few weeks of this, I became frustrated because I was thanking them, and nobody even acknowledged my thank you. And then one day, Peter came to me, and he says, why are you thanking me? I said, Peter, you're giving me your home, you're feeding me, you're taking care of me, it's such amazing hospitality, and, I was sitting with the elders, and I was really included deeply into the whole family and community, and I said, I'm really grateful, and I keep thanking you. And he said, thanking me for what? So I said, I don't know, the food, the shelter, And he said, why thank me? Thank God. That everything we have here is from God. And they believe it. It's not just, a nice thing to say. The fact that I was thanking them for food or for the shelter was beyond their comprehension, was beyond their culture, because they don't see these things as theirs. They don't own it. Interesting. So I think all these cultures around the world, and certainly in Judaism, we have very profound, deep concepts that should be understood and shared. All right. And there's a Sioux proverb, the Sioux, the indigenous people of the Americas, that if you're not rooted in your culture, if you don't know who you are as a people, you're like wind in the buffalo grass. You just move around, swayed. And I think this is very important for those of us studying anti-Semitism to understand Jewish notions of who we are and Jewish notions of dealing with this, because there's also Jewish understandings of dealing with this. How do you deal with physical anti-Semitism when people are trying to oppress you physically, when people are trying to oppress you culturally? Jews have perspectives. When you're facing physical annihilation, there's things to do. When you're facing, cultural assimilation, there are things to do. Right? Hanukkah is an important story for us in this exile. And Purim is equally important. Lots of lessons to be drawn. All right. So very briefly, there's 3 types of anti-Semitism that I think are relevant. And what makes anti-Semitism, I think, unique compared to other forms of hatreds, and of course all the hatreds that we discuss, all forms of discrimination, racism, sexism, homophobia, all forms of hatred could unleash profound suffering and pain upon people and upon society. I think what makes anti-Semitism unique is that it's inherently genocidal. Anti-Semitism, according to what Robert Wistrich, Elie Wiesel, and other scholars of anti-Semitism speak about how anti-Semitism is inherently genocidal. And I think anti-Semitism is a form of hatred that really emerges in Europe. It's a European phenomenon of Jew hatred. And I think as Bassam Tibi and other scholars have made the argument in other parts of the world, there's a history of discrimination against Jews, but I think anti-Semitism really emerges in Europe. So the first form of genocidal anti-Semitism is the Christian form of anti-Semitism. And I think Joel Kotek, I hope, will speak on this more during the program. So the Jew was perceived as the quintessential other. The Jew was accused of deicide, of killing the Christian notion of the Messiah. The Jew was stubborn and not willing to convert. And there was this perception in spreading the Gospels that if you didn't accept the Christian notion of the Messiah, you were blinded. You were blinded by evil, unworthy, incapable of having redemption. And if the Jew, the individual Jew, didn't convert and accept the Christian worldview, the Christian notion of the Messiah, the Jew was blind and condemned to hell, right? But what made anti-Semitism and what makes anti-Semitism inherently genocidal is the notion that until all the Jewish people convert, until all the Jewish people are saved, that there will not be world redemption, that the Jews are hindering the redemption of the world by not accepting the Christian notion of the Messiah and the Christian worldview. So the Jews had to be converted, forcibly converted, exiled, living on the margins of society. And in a sense, and there's a whole legacy of this, and I'm just mentioning it, this subject could be the subject of a course and a whole program. So I'm doing this very briefly. So when the dominant perspective of the worldview shifted from religion to notions of nation and race and ethnicity and sort of biologically determined notions of peoplehood, the Jew was perceived or constructed as not part of the nation and not part of the race. So suddenly Jews were living in spaces that were not part of the race. And unlike during the Christian forms of anti-Semitism, or when the Christianity was sort of the dominant form of anti-Semitism, there was no escaping racial categorization. That the scientists and the sociologists and the philosophers, von Herder, Hegel, Marx, race was perceived as something that was innate. So even if you were, let's say, a Jewish person and you were part of the Semitic race and you were not an Aryan or a white person, even if you mastered 10 European languages and played classical music and were refined and went to the best schools, you were still, of this racial category. There was no escaping the categorization, the biologically determined, socially constructed notions of identity. So unlike the Christian period where the Jew could convert theoretically to save their lives, when it came to racial notions of identities, there was no escape. And this sort of racist form of anti-Semitism, I would argue, culminates in the Shoah. It's very much part of the sort of the racial identities that emerged during Europe in the colonial times. And I'll just say, as a footnote, and I mentioned this last night, that Emmanuel Levinas, the sort of notion, the Jewish notion of humility and respecting the other, that we need the other to be human, right? So very different than the Christian, and it's Christian-rooted, European Christian-rooted 16th century notion of tolerance that we still discuss in multiculturalism that I think should be abolished, but that's another story, and replaced with notions of humility, that the Jewish notion of respecting the other is not based on some notion of tolerance, because tolerance is sort of could be a condescending notion. I have to tolerate the other. In Judaism, we need the other to be human. So I better start treating people well. If I'm a racist, I eliminate 1 billion opportunities to be a wise, enlightened person, or to be human. If I'm sexist, I eliminate 50% of the opportunities that I have to be a human being. So I hurt myself by not accepting the other. I need the other. Different than tolerance. And when I met the Pope a few years ago, I met him a few times, I met the Pope, and I told him the story. In Israel, there's 4 holy cities. There's Jerusalem, Hebron, Tzfat, and Tiberias. And they represent earth, wind, water, and fire. And Tzfat is where the Kabbalah comes from, represents air. And before I went to meet the Pope, I sat at the grave of Rabbi Shimon Bar Yochai. And I prayed the whole night, and I flew to Rome, to the Vatican, and I met the Pope, and I told him I came from Tzfat, and I was at the tomb of Shimon Bar Yochai. And in my culture, when you go to battle, or you go to an important diplomatic meeting, you sit and you pray at the tombs of the prophets and the rabbis, the sages. And I told the Pope I was at this grave, and his eyes lit up. He knew who he was. And Shimon Bar Yochai and his son were chased out of Jerusalem by the Romans and hunted, and they lived in a hole. And at night they would come out and study. And we study their amazing contribution to knowledge and wisdom and commentaries. And I told the Pope, I said, until you accept the Jewish people as being Jewish, you cannot be Christian. And I explained Levinas and the Jewish notion of we need each other. And I said, there's 2,000 years of bloodshed and of raping and pillaging and forced conversions, and it needs to stop. You need to recognize us for who we are so you can be who you are. And it actually was the beginning of a friendship. My colleagues who brought me to meet the Pope were very uncomfortable that I said it, and I said it very diplomatically, but they were horrified. But the Pope, I go to meet him regularly, and he got it. He understands it.
The current Pope?
The current Pope.
He answered.
He said, pray for me, and we've been meeting since. I said I pray for God, but okay. So we need to accept the other, and race is the objectification and the dehumanization of the other, and has justified a vicious history against the Jewish people and a vicious history against non-white people, white people, for centuries. So, and this sort of social construction of identity in the imagination and in the theology and the social sciences and the philosophy and the ideology is something that we cannot change, apparently. It's amazing. Even though I think it's 0.000301% of our phenotypical features in our DNA, our DNA is to the phenotypical features. And in the imagination of the scientists and the theologians and the philosophers, this is the ultimate difference between all of us and humanity. Mind-boggling. All right. So this old racist form of anti-Semitism and the Christian notions of anti-Semitism, which are inherently genocidal, and also race is inherently genocidal because the Jews were sort of intermingling with the white Aryan race, the white nation, and they were threatening the purity of the white Aryan nation, and they had to be removed. So as I was saying earlier, you can't convert, but you have to eliminate, drive the Jews out, or exterminate them to protect the purity of the white Aryan nation. And okay. So those forms of anti-Semitisms with an S have largely subsided over the decades after the Holocaust. And I think in some ways, for all sorts of reasons, which I'll touch on towards the end of my talk, they're beginning to reemerge in some spaces for the first time in decades. But in liberal, kind of postmodern spaces like universities and the media of record, the Christian forms of anti-Semitism and the racist forms of anti-Semitism is kind of not permitted. And I think if scholars or students or journalists in these spaces engage in racist anti-Semitism or in Christian chauvinistic anti-Semitism, I think they'd be in significant trouble. Their careers could end, they'd be ostracized. It's not really accepted in these spaces. But the new or the contemporary form of anti-Semitism, the demonization of who Jews are as a people, is not only tolerated, it's encouraged, particularly in these liberal spaces, in these sort of postmodern spaces of universities, of higher education, and the media of record. So, as Israel becomes demonized as an apartheid, racist, colonial entity, Jewish communities in the diaspora who have a strong affinity to Israel for cultural reasons, for religious reasons, for family connections, for political, the Jewish people are bound up in the life and history and culture and religion of Israel. So as Israel was demonized for decades, so too have Jewish communities in diasporas, particularly in Europe and North America. So as I was saying last night, if you go to a synagogue in Europe or North America or South America today, there's security. In some places, very high levels of security. And in these sort of postmodern university spaces, if students and faculty show some sort of affiliation or connection to Israel, they are also attacked and part of the problem. And if Israel is an apartheid, racist, colonial state, as the detractors claim, then from a human rights liberal perspective, it must be dismantled, like the apartheid regime, right? So that's what's at stake. If people are labeling Israel as an apartheid state from a liberal human rights perspective, it would have to be dismantled. And if young Jewish students and faculty are at university spaces defending the apartheid, racist, fascist, colonial entity, well, they're in the firing line as well. So in these spaces, if you are, anti-Israel, want it to be removed or significantly altered, then I think as a journalist and as a scholar and as a faculty member, you're promoted. You're encouraged. And this is, the dominant contemporary form of anti-Semitism or of the anti-Semitisms. And so we all know this. And what's unique and interesting in this contemporary form of anti-Semitism is this sort of strange alliances that emerge in this contemporary form of anti-Semitism. So we have what we call the Red-Green Alliance. So you have the sort of the radical left, the red, and the radical green, the Islamists, who kind of are opposed to Western hegemony and see Israel as sort of the tip of the spear in the Middle East as a sort of the colonial racist entity, and they attack Israel and the Jewish communities politically and intellectually. So you have this odd red-green alliance where you have people like Judith Butler, who I would consider one of those clowns, that would actually said, and she's a very important philosopher at Columbia University, Jewish, gay, feminist, who said famously that Hezbollah and Hamas should be perceived as part of the progressive global left, right? So if I would go to Gaza or Tehran, I'd get one bullet in the head. Judith Butler is a woman, a feminist, a gay activist, and a woman who has a career, she'd probably get 4 bullets. But in this sort of the madness of this intellectual moment, right, somebody like Judith Butler, right, can kind of make these articulations, and not only is it accepted, but these type of views are encouraged in the academy. And of course, Hamas and Hezbollah are not only, and I'm choosing my words very carefully, genocidal in its anti-Semitism, they're also sexist, they're homophobic, they don't have toleration for moderate Muslims or other forms of minorities, or other groups of minorities. So it's incredible. So in this intellectual space, it's also interesting to note people like Michel Foucault and Edward Said, 2 very important figures in the academy. They were, for example, proponents of the Islamic Revolution in Iran. They were hanging out with dissidents in the 1970s in Paris and were saying that the Iranian Revolution or the Islamic Revolution was going to be something akin to what the French Revolution and Enlightenment was to Europe. This was going to happen or begin to happen in Iran. So you have these sort of postmodern intellectuals, these post-colonial giants, arguing that the Iranian Revolution was going to be something positive, despite its genocidal anti-Semitism, despite the sexism, despite the political oppression, despite the fact that Muslims from different perspectives were not tolerated by these exiled leaders. And what's also interesting to note, and we're doing work on this in a project, Edward Said famously said, and I think this is really important to understand how anti-Semitism is deeply structured in our society, deeply structured. So Edward Said famously said that he is the last remaining Jewish intellectual, that he is the inheritor or the heir, what do you say? The heir, sorry, of the Frankfurt School of Thought. The Frankfurt School of Thought, as we know, were a group mainly of Jewish refugees from Germany who created a very important school of thought, a sort of a Marxist, progressive framework of a school of thought or thinking, and played a profound role on the sort of the foundational philosophy and discourse emerging after the Holocaust and the Second World War. They famously looked at anti-Semitism. They did a very important studies on totalitarianism and Nazism, right? The first scholars dealing with Nazism and the Holocaust. And Said said that he was the hire of the Frankfurt School, Jewish refugee intellectuals, and that he was the last remaining Jewish intellectual, and the Jewish intellectuals in the academy now were living in suburbs and getting fat. And that he was the last Jew, and that the Palestinians were the Jews, and the Jews were the fascist Israelis, and they were the Nazis. So you have inversion. It's called replacement theology, as Aaron noted last night. So imagine how replacement theology, which is so fundamentally deep in Western civilization, you have a clown, I'm sorry to say this, an intellectual, an important intellectual, like Edward Said, who can get away with saying that he's the last remaining Jew, that his people are the Jews that were exterminated in the Holocaust, and that the Jews are the killers of Christ, whoops, the Nazis. And we have been so conditioned over century upon century upon century of this theology that progressive people, secular people in the academy drink it like water, unconsciously. So imagine, in less than a generation, the Jew has gone, and I grew up with Holocaust survivors. I lived with Holocaust survivors. We've gone, in my lifetime, I've seen Holocaust, we saw one last night. People who were exterminated for not being white, to now we are the Nazis. From Jews being the Christ killers, losing the covenant, and people replacing us, Edward Said and the postmodernists are replacing us once again. And this goes unchallenged. We're unconscious once again. It's interesting. This stuff goes deep. And I think, when I was a kid learning about racism, and I got this idea for the Summer Institute with a colleague of mine, a baby Zagaya, who's from Ethiopia. Some friends of him are here. And I was a kid doing my PhD here, and he had this summer school on racism and colonialism. And he brought all these African scholars and intellectuals to Oxford, and I was looking at racism in Canada, and I thought, wow, I want to come. It was very expensive, but I helped the baby. I volunteered for 2 months organizing the Summer Institute, and I was allowed to attend for free. And actually, I got the idea for the Summer Institute from this experience. But listening to all these amazing professors, mostly from the United States and Southern Africa, looking at the history of colonialism and racism, I was like, I didn't know. And I was learning how all this stuff is deeply embedded in our language, in our cities, in our history, right? And it's the same thing, but we're not equipped. We don't have the legacy, we don't have the depth of contemporary anti-Semitism studies to understand how Edward Said is replacement theology. And replacement theology is a core element of Western Christian society. So it shouldn't shock us that people are drinking this up uncritically. It kind of makes sense to these cultural, symbolic elements that we sort of we respond to, right? So it's interesting. All right. So why is anti-Semitism exploding? And I'll just say one more thing. I did a study with Ed Kaplan, which is interesting. which showed the correlation between Israel bashing and classical forms of anti-Semitism. So we did this in 2006, and this study, the scientific study, helped to lay the foundation of the IRA definition and justified looking at the demonization of Israel and Israel bashing as part of contemporary anti-Semitism. Because in 2006, if you said this, well, you were a fascist, white supremacist, colonial apartheid, Nazi, Zionist advocate. You weren't a scholar. So it was difficult to do it. But we interviewed 10,000 people in 10 European countries, and we asked them questions of classical forms of anti-Semitism, like Jews are cheaters, and they're bad in business, and they usurp societies, the old stuff, and questions about Israel, like the Israeli Defense Forces intentionally shoot Palestinian children, that Israel poisons the water of Palestinians, questions like that. And if you were on our scale, if you answered a certain amount of questions, you were deemed an Israel basher or anti-Semitic, and anti-Semitic in the classical sense. And what we discovered was that those who demonize Israel are 13 times more likely than the average in these 10 European countries to also be anti-Semitic. So the correlation is off the charts. So if people hate Israel, not all of them, but they are 13 times more likely to be anti-Semitic in the classical sense. So if this can of water was 13 times more likely to cause cancer than other water, this would be removed from the shelves, it would be banned from being sold, and there'd be an inquiry how this poison could be sold, right? So the correlation was strong, and this helped to justify the study, including in the definitions of anti-Semitism, issues about Israel. And I'll tell you a quick story. I'll go on for 10 more minutes and I'll stop, and we'll have Q&A. I did this at Yale, and when you're at Yale, there's a lot of PR and stuff that goes on at these Ivy League universities. So our study that I did with Ed Kaplan was, it was in a good journal, the Journal of Conflict Resolution, and the findings were it was the first scientific study that proved the correlation between anti-Semitism and Israel bashing. So the New York Times, The Guardian, Le Monde, all these papers were writing about our study because we showed the correlation. So my parents, I was in New Haven, Connecticut, my parents live in Montreal, and my parents are known to have nice Shabbat dinners. They usually have a lot of friends and family over, and I would try to drive up, it's a 6-hour drive, I'd go to see my parents in Montreal for Shabbat as much as I could. And so I get there for Shabbat, there's like 20 people around the table, and my mother, who got married at 17 years old and had me when she was 19, didn't finish school. And despite her lack of formal education, she's an extraordinarily smart, insightful person. So she said, so she tells everybody at the table to be quiet. And she said, Charles, I tried to read the article, but it was very mathematical. I couldn't understand. Can you explain it to me? So I explained to her and the table what I just explained to you. And then my mother said, how long did it take you to do this? So I said, we worked on the project for about 2 years, 2.5 years. And then she said, what was the budget for the project? And I told her. And she turns to the table and she says, my son, the professor, it took him 2.5 years and all this money to prove what everybody here already knows.
How much money, Charlie?
So in a sense, and it was mentioned last night, the people who experience hatred, the people who experience the hatred, they know. They know. You don't have to have a PhD. In fact, sometimes when you have a PhD and when you're educated by the likes of these replacement theology, which is the new philosophy, the dominant form of postmodern cutting-edge thinking, you get confused. And it's the people in the sciences or people like my mother who know what's happening to her grandchildren at school, what's happening to her kids, what's happening to her neighbors, what's happening to the community. They know. They know. It's we who are a little bit confused, right? So that should give us, a little bit of humility as well. Scholars, we don't have a great history of standing up for the oppressed. Actually, we have a wonderful history of laying the intellectual and scientific foundations for the oppression. And we should bear that in mind. There's wonderful work on the role of universities. Anyways, so why is this happening? Why is there an upsurge in anti-Semitism? Why is there an upsurge in xenophobia, of racism, of attacks on women, on gay people? Why? Why is this happening? And I think, we know as the sort of the legacy of anti-Semitism that when things are difficult politically and economically, people are more susceptible to blame the other, more susceptible to scapegoating. We know this from history. And I think this goes back to my what I presented at the beginning, or mentioned at the beginning. There's a real need for an interdisciplinary study of anti-Semitism. There's a serious scholarship. And I think, in a way, we know that the conditions for the Holocaust really began to emerge in the interwar period. There was massive unemployment. There was massive dislocation from political institutions. And this were the fertile grounds for the rise of Nazism and fascism. We know this from history. We know that people were so marginalized and so desperate when the fascists came, when the Nazis came with their easy ideas and blamed the Jews, that people were susceptible and it resonated. And after the Holocaust, the world got together and we built these international institutions of human rights, like the United Nations. We created international law. We created the covenant against genocide. Right? Most of these people were actually Jewish lawyers and survivors who helped to create these institutions. And we said never again. And the world got together and created these institutions, and we said we'll never allow the conditions of massive marginalization to exist where these reactionary social movements will emerge and havoc and chaos will prevail. So we developed notions of a minimum wage, of basic health care, of basic education, of employment, of notions of citizenship, right? And modern nation states in Europe, North America, in the decolonizing world, created strong states, and the state was going to be the vehicle in which modernization and economic development would happen, and it would guarantee the basic rights of all citizens, so that we would never again live in a condition where Nazism and fascism and brutality would emerge. This was the lesson of the Holocaust, and the world seemed to have learned it. So when I grew up in Canada, I went to McGill University, for example, a good university by any standards, I think on the level or almost on the level of a good American or a British university or French university, and I paid $200 a year, 200 Canadian dollars, 120 American dollars to go to a very good school, right? So education, access to education was universal. Healthcare, right? Growing up in Canada, growing up in Western Europe, in Israel, not the United States, but that's a whole other story. Healthcare was a human right guaranteed to all citizens, right? So the state, Canadians and the Europeans paid a higher level of tax, but we were part of a society, of a state apparatus that provided these basic human rights, and it created a cohesiveness. So even though there was French and English tensions in Quebec and anti-Semitism and racism, yes there was, but we were all proud of our healthcare system. We were all proud of our education system. We were connected and united by these human rights and by the goods and services that the state helped to ensure and deliver. And even in countries like Egypt, it wasn't at the level of Canada, because Canada is a wealthier country than Egypt, but the state in Egypt gave basic levels of education, subsidization for basic food and healthcare. So the state was the vehicle. But then, I would argue, neoliberal globalization comes into play. And neoliberal globalization, the ideology was that capitalism and free market capitalism would usher in modernization and economic development, and with modernization and economic development we'd have more democratic culture and practice. This is the view. And what happened was notions of structural adjustment. In the early, Reaganomics and Thatcher and the G7 at the time imposed structural adjustment. So in countries like Africa, the Middle East, even in the West and in developed countries, the state was ordered to get out of the marketplace and allow the marketplace to take over from the state. So we have a withering or withdrawal of the state and a withering notion of human rights. So now, I think to go to, for a British person 20, 30 years ago to go to Oxford, it was almost free. And I don't know, what's the tuition now?
Bloody expensive.
What do you pay a year? What do you pay? Roughly.
No, I
Nine,
think we
no?
receive student loans, but I think it's around 9,500 a year. But it's
There's a
going
cap.
up every. When my
Okay.
brother went a few years ago, it was what, 6.5? It's gone up
Okay.
by 3,000.
And when I came here to study in the 80s and 90s, it was free for British students, and I think we paid £2,000 as foreigners, right?
Per term or per year?
For a year. And then you look at the United States, and Ivy League education or private education is
Sweden is 50,000.
50,000.
Plus accommodation.
All right. So we have the withdrawal of this. We have the withdrawal of the state. Please let me just finish. And what we have noticed in the last 40 years was structural adjustment and neoliberalism. As the state withdraws, please let me finish. Excuse me, let me finish, please. As the state withdraws, we see the fragmentation of society. We could even look at Israel. Israel was a very egalitarian society until the 1980s. There was very little disparity of income and access. The access was limited, but there was pretty much equal access to goods, services, and institutions in Israel. And with free market liberalization in Israel, like countries throughout the world, you have sort of an uber rich, and you have those that are disenfranchised from political institutions and from the economy. Sort of endemic unemployment, endemic underemployment. And in this environment, you have fragmentation. And as Emmanuel Castells argue, identity becomes the last space of the marginalized to struggle. When you remove people from political institutions and economic institutions and the processes, they go back and they fight to defend themselves based on identity. And in this vacuum, you can see the emergence of the Muslim Brotherhood. Well, the Muslim Brotherhood is 100 years old, but they gain in popularity. As the state withdraws, you have reactionary social movements like the Muslim Brotherhood emerging in societies and states that are collapsing, literally falling apart, and the rise of nationalism and xenophobia in sort of Western European and North American spaces as well. Communities are fragmented and becoming increasingly disconnected from each other. So I'll just say that globalization has a direct bearing on contemporary anti-Semitism. During the last several decades, nationalism and new forms of identity politics have exacerbated existing socioeconomic and political cleavages. The causes of this emerging crisis include the extension of competitive global markets and the effects of structural adjustment, the intensification of socioeconomic inequalities, the blurring of international and domestic politics and conflicts. You have a worldwide escalation in adversarial identity politics. The extension of information technology and travel possibilities has created global spaces. And this is inhabited by a growing cadre of transnational professionals and specialists. From the perspective of the high-rise corporate economy, and actually this is also a space of transnational, right? We're characters from all over the world coming to Oxford. Right? We have the capacity to be here. Right? So, I'll explain this in a minute. So from high, glossy, corporate, economic, cultural spaces, the city down below appears to be inhabited by immigrant populations competing for low-wage jobs in an in an increasingly informalized urban economy, and as the state retreats. The combined economic and political imperatives of globalization sweep away the particularities of time and space to generate common outcomes everywhere growing racial, ethnic, and cultural heterogeneity coupled with social and spatial polarization. At the most general level, it's possible to think of globalization in terms of a movement or circulation. A common thread that runs through I'll just be brief. Those of us that are globalized kind of are not fixed in time and space. The more time and space that you can cover, the more globalized you are. So you have corporate elites that can press a button and invest millions of dollars at a flip of a switch. I don't know, middle class professional scholars, we can travel and we can communicate as never before. So we're part of the globalized elite. 50 years ago, a good espresso, I guess, was in Rome. Now you can get a good espresso at a college in Oxford or in New York City or in Montreal or in some resort. And it's sort of those of us who are globalized, we're able to communicate, meet, interact, do business together. So this is the top initiating part of globalization. Those who are on the receiving end of globalization are disconnected from economic and social and political institutions and processes and are stuck in time and stuck in space. And if we look at our societies, there's more communities that are just disconnected. They don't leave their space. They don't leave their sphere. And this fragmentation of society are the conditions that are comparable, in my view, and in the view of others, other scholars, to the interwar period between World War I and World War II, or between World War I and the Shoah. And it's in these conditions where people are increasingly marginalized, where goods and services are being removed, where the state was the cement of identity and of the receiving of goods and services. As that withdraws, we have the fragmentation and the conditions which are ripe for the disenfranchised, for the angry, for the fearful, to latch on to nationalist, jingoistic ideologies. You can think of Trump, you can think of Hungary, and you can think of the rising intolerance that we see in our midst. And it's in these conditions that anti-Semitism and all other forms of hatred are rising. And I think anti-Semitism, in a way, the Jews are sort of the canary in the coal mine. We're the early radar system for society as a whole. And when the Jews are becoming very concerned, increasingly every year, more and more concerned about the rise of anti-Semitism, the intellectuals still perceive this in some circles as just, a ruse, a political ruse to defend Israel from criticism. And they're not paying attention. So on the one hand, we don't have the tools of analysis to really understand what's going on as scholars. And on the other hand, we have people, for all sorts of political expediency, ignoring the alarm bells that have been ringing in the Jewish community for quite a few years now, for about 20 years. And I think the role of the intellectual, or the failure of the intellectual, is important to note. So I'll end there, and I'll take any questions and comments.
You can go first.
Yeah, go ahead.
All right. Kind of a layered question. I read the chapter in volume 1 last night to the co-author chapter. But I have a layered question. I need to preface it first. So, there's two things that I'm in constant conversation with myself as I'm present here that I want to be able to take back to my community. One is my religious background causes for me to have what I consider a Christ-centered anthropology. So I want to, if I believe what Christ was, the God-man, there's something about quintessential humanity that he brings. I need to be able to celebrate humanity and be a stalwart champion for humanity in every context. So that's one thing. Second thing is, as you mentioned, there are other marginalized groups who have a little bit of a head start of a constructive structural analysis of some of these things. And so I'm always thinking about how can I take this back to the Black community. So those are the purposes. With that in mind, and you start thinking about the contemporary form of racism as the demonization of Israel, particularly like as an apartheid system. Okay. One of the questions that's still looming for me: does the critique against anti-Semitism, do Jews have a conceptual framework of self-critique, particularly as it relates to either marginalized communities outside of Semitic groups like Blacks in America, or marginalized Semitic groups within Semitic identity? So as an analogy, I can point to structural analysis of internalized racism within the Black community. I can point to inter-communal dialogue where we critique ourselves, like colorism, for example, right? Where whether it is internalizing racist things against one another or some type of hierarchy. I bring that up because, as you mentioned, there is a period where Jews are grandfathered into the white identity. You know, whether it's to be a whooping boy, that's a whole nother thing, right? I think it was insightful to say, yeah, you know, essentially you become like this quintessential paradigm of racism. We're going to grandfather you in, but you get to take the blunts. So I think that's a great insight. I think it's a great insight. When I listen to like Mizrahi Jews or African Jews, contemporarily, but even speak of like when the Operation Moses or Solomon or whatever, like the bringing the Falasha to Zion.
Falasha means stranger and foreigner.
Okay, so what's the better Jew? Beta? Or what's the better?
Bet Israel.
It is.
Or Ethiopian Jew.
Thank you.
These are just the words that creep into our perspective.
No, I need to thank you for that. So it's been a long time since so beta Jews. So, but for them to speak of their own experience of feeling marginalized, I don't know if this spoken of it as an apartheid system, but at least feeling marginalized in the fact that, you know, or a privilege of Ashkenazi Jews over, right? I'm struggling with, so on one hand, I can accept, I know it's hard, I'm done, I'm almost done. I understand how saying, for example, Israel having demonizing Israel or having its own state is anti-Semitic in the same way that saying that, you know, why do blacks need to have their own television show? It's the same thing, right? It's a kind of a defense mechanism that denies the marginalization.
Right.
So I get that, but I'm wondering. As I read yesterday, also some of the statements, like it doesn't seem to have very much space for qualification. Where, for example, Mizrahi Jew or an African Jew could say, "Hey, you know what? I'm feeling this marginalization. You know, whatever, there's this privilege or whatever, this does feel like an apartheid system. Is there any type of internal critique? Does that make sense?
Who says it feels like an apartheid system?
Well, I don't know the language. I don't know. I know I've read stuff of feelings of marginalization of like Mizrahi Jews or Ashkenazi Jews. I know I've read that's so. I don't know if they're using the exact language of apartheid system,
They're not.
but it.
No,
They're not.
no.
They're not.
Okay.
So, yeah, if I could,
Okay. Yeah. Sure. Go ahead.
you want to,
Sure.
I don't want to interrupt you.
No, no. Go ahead. Yes.
You're done? All right, I don't want, yeah.
I can.
Go
I
ahead.
can be sustained.
Go ahead. You want to finish up? I don't want to
Go
interrupt. Okay. So I wrote down the notes. So, if I address issues of anti-Semitism and the Jewish condition, and I address your perspective of Christ-centric living,
Sure.
structural analysis, the self-criticism within the Jewish community, the feeling of apartheid among marginalized Jews.
Sure.
If I address all of these issues, then you'll join me in the struggle of to fight anti-Semitism.
Well, I'm already in the struggle. I'm already joining.
Okay.
That's what I'm here.
But your question, like, it reminds me, and I say this with love and respect.
Sure.
Yeah. It reminds me of some of the white liberal racists that were dealing with the African American community in the 1950s and 60s during the Civil Rights Movement.
Okay.
They were saying, yes, you'll be enfranchised, but you're not quite ready. You got to get your families in order. You got to get this in order. You got to get more educated. You got to do this. And if you do all this
Okay.
crap, right, then we can deal with you. Then we'll consider enfranchisement. Then you can get the vote.
I'm not interested.
No.
Yeah,
You know, so you put the onus on the victim to live up. And when they live up, based on your standards, then they qualify as human, they qualify as citizens. So your words also remind me of, you know, in Malcolm X when he goes to do the Hajj, American guy, right? Victim of racism, segregation, violence, the whole 9 yards. And he goes to Mecca, and he's blown away because he's sharing food with people to the American in him. They look white, and they look brown, and they look black, and everybody's hanging out together, and they're sleeping in the same space and eating the same food, and he's blown away.
Sure.
And then he begins to realize that, you know, the world doesn't see reality like Americans. There's different ways of seeing, there's different ways of being. And respectfully, the world and the Jewish community and the Jewish people, and I say thankfully, do not see the world entirely, although there's a large Jewish American population. We don't see the world through the lens of America, thank God. And America, as you know, in my humble opinion, is, you know, the brutality, the violence, the legacy of racism and slavery is alive and well in America. And I would say that the perspective of how Jews perceive themselves needs to be understood from, I would say, a Jewish perspective or Jewish perspectives with an S. And I think it's all about recognizing the other. And I'll just say from my humble experience, I was very active in the anti-apartheid movement, and I was on the ground active in South Africa. And in the Summer Institute that impressed me so deeply, and this is the model that we're using, it was during the pre-negotiations of ending apartheid. And the summer school was organized under the auspices of the African National Congress, and then the ANC invited the PAC, the Pan-African Congress, to join us. And then they decided, there were some white liberals around who wanted to join. So the grandson of Verwoerd and some other white liberals, which they wanted to join us. So this was sort of pre-negotiations. This was pre-negotiations. And so I was like a Jewish, Israeli, Canadian kid, very concerned about apartheid and racism, but I don't know, I sat and I listened. I learned. I wasn't going to tell people from South Africa, you got to do this and you can't do that, and you got to prove to me that you're worthy. I sat and I listened. I really tried, and I tried my best to understand. And I was, very fortunate and honored to play a small role in that whole moment. But I didn't start telling people, you have to live up to my standards to I listened, I learned, I tried it,
Is that what you, and that's okay if it's fine, is this you perceive that you?
Yeah, I to be blunt
Sure,
and
please.
truthful, and I think, as we say, we're having ISGAP only
Yeah.
conversations. Yeah, I think that, that how apartheid, and I know you're well-meaning, I know where you come from, I know your family.
Yes, sir. Yes, sir.
So, this language of anti-Semitism and dehumanization creeps into our discourse, right? And of racism and sexism and homophobia, I think we really need to understand, if we're fighting anti-Semitism, the Jewish condition and the Jewish perspective of
And can I just say that?
Of course.
And then I'm done.
take your time.
So, I agree with that, and I mean, that's why, but internalized racism and all that, so I understand how language can take on its own meta-narrative. I understand that. I would argue that my question doesn't come from the meta-narrative of white hegemony as much as it does from our own marginalized community of thinking about the overlap
Yeah.
between the groups. And so, where I would say, evaluating my own community, I can see some of the residual effects of hegemonic structures. And there's an internal dialogue that has raised questions. And so I would say that I'm not appropriating the hegemonic structures. I'm looking at the overlap between our communities and saying, is there something comparable? We can talk about the overlap and intersection with hatred and things like that. And as you said, you got your example, your idea from this, from racism, colonial, right? So there are already intellectual dialogue that potentially we could be ahead in some cases. So it's not. You understand? I'm trying to be. I don't want to be offensive.
Yeah, no,
Yeah.
and I get it, and that's
Yeah.
a very important, to me and to our colleagues and people around the table, this is very important, the intersection of the African American and Jewish experience in fighting hatred together, apart, it could be a space that could be very creative and powerful, and we can learn from each other and maybe help each other to move forward. I get it, and I appreciate it, and it's very important. But at the same time, I heard you say Jews have become white. The feeling of apartheid among members of the Jewish community.
Yeah, I was just repeating what you said.
No, so I didn't.
Yeah, no. When you said that some people, the clowns have.
I see.
Yeah. I was just saying
okay,
that
okay.
there is a. I'm not saying that they're white, but there is a cultural milieu where you accept it as such.
Yes. Definitely.
Yeah. No. That's yeah.
Yeah. Okay, so I didn't get what you're saying. Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah.
But okay, I've talked enough.
No, it's okay. No, we'll continue the conversation.
So
Thank you. Thanks.
I would like to address. You said it sort of jokingly, but it seemed like the kind of joke that belies a little bit of the truth. Referring to these academics as clowns, and I don't disagree with the reasoning behind it. I just question if we aren't playing into something that you, in the same breath, proceeded to criticize, the sort of identity politics and culture clashing that has become so predominant in modern scholarly and political discourse, one of the biggest drivers behind a lot of this conflict is the idea of single issue voting, of single issue academics. You know, you can only be a Republican voter if you believe in these things. You can only be a Democratic voter if you believe in these things. And I believe that creating this idea that you cannot support certain academics and certain political groups because there exists within it this idea of, you know, you agree with everything they believe, except they don't like Israel. And aren't we playing into that by referring to people who I think we can all agree, people like Judith Butler, Michel Foucault, Edward Said are some of the most, you know, accomplished and respectable scholars of our time, but we are dismissing them sort of not quite out of hand, but on a whole, referring them as clowns because one of the things that they said is something that we disagree with, and not just disagree with. I will obviously say, you know, it is part of anti-Semitism, it is part of this, all of this bigotry and everything that we're talking about,
Yeah.
but are we not making sort of a major mistake by doing that sort of thing?
It's a good question. Well, interesting. So I guess from a Western liberal, postmodern perspective, one would say if there's a contradiction or a problem with an element of somebody's body of work or personal life, we can overlook it. We can critique the one or two ideas that are problematic, but we can accept the contribution of the 100 ideas that were positive, right? That's one way of looking at it, and there's validity in it. From a Jewish perspective, for example, and it's just a thought, if we want to bring Jewish culture into all of this, you can have a rabbi or a Torah, you know, somebody who comments on the Torah and the wisdom in Judaism, and if they mistreat their wife, for example, or if they're a horrible person, but they're a genius in their intellectual contribution, we take their body of work and we take it out of the canon. So that's one way of dealing with it, and there's another way of dealing with it. Both are kind of rooted in culture and tradition. I don't know which one is better. Do we take the genius work of the wife beater, or do we throw out Edward Said's good ideas and keep his bad ideas? I don't know. But it's an interesting discussion and debate, and one that I think we should put a lot of energy and effort into it. Having said that, I think if Edward Said is using replacement theory, and if these intellectuals like Butler, I can't really see you because Gabby's there. Sorry. If Edward Said and Butler and these sort of intellectuals are playing a powerful role in the demonization of Jewish people, in the demonization of Israel, in giving the intellectual acceptance, permission to attack Jews in the classroom, to attack Jewish students and faculty in universities, to create situations where increasingly Jewish faculty and Jewish students feel unwelcome. And you're referring to the United States of America, even though you come from Israel, with the Democrats and the Republicans. In the United States of America, there are university spaces that are clearly spaces that are becoming free of Jews. Jews don't feel comfortable going to spaces that they've been going for decades. And that's in the intellectual environment. As people learn now, for the second generation, scholarship that calls Israel an apartheid state, and if Israel is an apartheid state, from a liberal human rights perspective, it must be dismantled. That's what's at stake.
I understand.
Now let me just finish, please, and I'll let you respond or say whatever you wish to, of course. It gives the intellectual environment is now seeping into Congress and the Senate. It's now dominant in the media of record internationally, where this is accepted. And this has bearing on the lives of Jewish people. You know, Gabby walked in and he said it was missile season in Israel as a joke, but it is. There are social movements as we speak, as you know, who, and I didn't get into it, but political Islam essentially takes a very narrow reactionary understanding of Islam and connects it with European anti-Semitism. It takes the protocols of the elders of Zion, the words and ideas that led to the extermination of 6 million Jews and the removal of every Jew from European society. Remove them. Those words and ideas, as Elie Wiesel said, the Holocaust, the crematorium did not cause the Holocaust. It was the words and ideas that created the railroad tracks and the crematoriums. Those words and ideas are the ideology of people that were launching missiles to hit any Jew possible, Mizrahi, Ashkenazi, rich or poor Jews. And it's that ideology that the Saids and the Butlers created this Red-Green Alliance that justifies Iran's quest for a nuclear weapon to exterminate Israel because they're obligated from their religious perspective, which takes Islam and the protocols of the elders of Zion and creates this reactionary social movements. The Brotherhood is the root of the tree, and it goes off into Hamas and Hezbollah and Islamic Jihad and Al-Qaeda, Daesh, and goes to create the ideological foundations of the Iranian revolutionary regime, which Said was a proponent of. This is it takes European fascist Nazi ideology, the protocols of the elders of Zion that created the conditions for the Holocaust. These are people spreading that idea among intellectuals. And when the regime is openly trying to create a nuclear weapon to exterminate the little Satan, they have a moral obligation to destroy Israel and that the Jews are the cancer of the world based on the protocols of the elders of Zion. And you have clowns passing this off and justifying these military actions as we speak, and the intellectuals are being taught, well, Israel's an apartheid state. The people of the region are oppressed by this cancer, the cancer on the garment of Islam. And the Jews, who are the only people with self-determination on Islamic land in the world, have to be eradicated. And the Western intellectuals, where are we?
As I said, I don't disagree with what you're saying in that these things that they are teaching are justifying a lot of the sort of everything you just said, basically. But all I ask is, where is the room for nuance? Where is the room for accepting all the other things that they are saying? Because, I mean, aren't we throwing the baby out with the bathwater here?
Look, I use the work of Said. I've used the work of Said. I've been educated by this. I took his classes.
And that sounds, I'd love to hear some of those stories, but the question that I'm really asking here is, where do we draw lines? Aren't you, in that whole very interesting and passionate speech that you just gave, aren't you catastrophizing in the same way that single issue anti-abortion voters do? When you say that you have to take a certain perspective, a certain stand for or against a certain group because of one thing, because that makes them evil inherently, how is it any different just because we have a slightly more scholarly and academic perspective to put behind it?
I know, you keep doing this, I get it. We'll end in 3 minutes. Look, you're asking a great question. It's a great question. I'm not being, I'm being sincere. And it's a question. I mean, modernity, and you could even say Western colonialism, did it bring anything to the world? Did modernity and enlightenment and even colonialism bring positive things to the Americas and Africa and Asia? Or do we throw the baby out with the bathwater? So if the African, just thinking of apartheid, you have the ANC that says, yes, let's take modernity, let's take notions of Western liberal democracy and create a rainbow nation and have inclusion. We won't throw the baby out with the bathwater. You had the PAC, the Pan-African Congress, that was saying one settler, one bullet. get all these colonialists out of our land. And to hell with them. And to hell with their ideology and their philosophy and their theology, and let's return to our culture and to our land. It's a debate. You know, it's a good question, and I can't answer it in 30 seconds, but it's an important question. But I think at the very least we have to expose the genocidal anti-Semitism in the world today, and how Western liberal intellectuals, or some Western postmodern liberal intellectuals, are actually in bed with this reactionary social movement, which is anti-Semitic, sexist, homophobic, anti-democratic, anti-citizenship. And what do we do as intellectuals? How do we struggle against it? It's a good question. Anyways, I think we need to end.
Dr. Maxwell had her hand up.
I know.
You're paying for the interviews that you won't have if you don't end right now.
What? Yeah, no, we were supposed to end 15 minutes ago, and everybody's upset. So we'll end here. There'll be plenty of time for conversation and questions. So please, we have 15 minutes of coffee instead of 30 minutes.